They said the storm would keep everyone apart. But how would you feel if your own father texted, "This year, just your sister's family? You don't need to come." I didn't argue. I didn't beg. That same night, I unlocked the doors of my $12 million oceanfront hotel to everyone else who had nowhere to go. By midnight, fireworks lit up over the Pacific, and there were 128 missed calls from the people who once shut me out. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The message came in just as the sun slipped behind the Pacific, painting my office in gold and violet light. This year, just your sister's family. You don't need to come. 8 words, no punctuation, no warmth, just finality. I stared at the screen for a long time. The glass windows reflected the ocean behind me, the waves catching fire from the sunset. I typed 2 words back. Perfect. Then I set the phone face down on the desk and listened to the muffled hum of the hotel below. It's funny how quiet rejection sounds. You expect thunder, a sharp crack, something dramatic. Instead, it's soft, familiar, like a door closing gently because it's been shut too many times before. Outside my office, the staff was stringing the last of the Christmas lights across the lobby railing. Someone laughed. Someone called for more garland. The sound was distant, almost comforting, and yet it made the space around me feel even emptier. I walked down the hallway, heels tapping against marble, the faint scent of pine following me. Through the glass wall, I could see the last guests of the day checking in their luggage, gliding silently across the floor. I'd built every inch of this place. The Solara Bay Hotel, Monterey, California, from sketches I once made on napkins during night shifts. 42 rooms facing the ocean. A rooftop bar that glowed like amber at night, and a lobby that always smelled of salt and citrus. And yet, standing there, I felt like an outsider in my own creation. I stopped at the elevator and caught my reflection in the stainless doors. Neat bun beige suit. A woman who looked like she had everything under control. "Looks about right," I murmured, and pressed the button for the top floor. The elevator opened to the rooftop terrace, where the sky was turning indigo. The ocean stretched endlessly, the horizon a thin silver line. I leaned against the railing, feeling the wind tangle my hair. If I'd been anyone else, maybe I'd have texted back something dramatic demanded an explanation. But that wasn't how my family worked. The hearts never fought. They edited each other out with silence. My father, Richard, was a man who measured affection in quarterly earnings, and invitations withheld. He used to say distance builds discipline. I think what he really meant was, "I don't know how to love you the way you want." I exhaled slowly, letting the cold air burn my lungs. All my life I'd been told that what they did wasn't personal. When I didn't make the family Christmas card, it was just simpler this way. When my Stanford acceptance letter got distracted, "That's nice, but Berkeley's closer." When my sister Chloe's engagement took over every dinner conversation and my job opening the hotel got a polite nod, "It's not personal, Maddie." But when your own father says you're not needed for New Year's, it's not just personal, it's surgical, precise, clean, the kind of cut that doesn't bleed until later. Down below, I could see the hotel sign begin to glow. Solara Bay. The letters flickering on one by one. Guests were gathering near the bar, laughing under the golden lights. I'd designed the place to feel warm, alive, full of presence. Tonight, it felt like a theater after the curtain fell. I pulled my coat tighter and stared toward the horizon. Somewhere down the coast, my family was probably already planning the menu, discussing centerpieces, Chloe's baby, Chloe's husband, Chloe's perfect life. I used to think that if I just achieved enough, worked harder, smiled more, stayed silent, longer, they'd make room for me. But there's no room at a table that was never meant to seat you. The wind picked up, whipping against my hair. The glass balcony shimmered under the fading light. I rested my hands on the cool metal railing and whispered, "If they don't need me there, maybe I never belonged there at all." For a moment, the thought stung. Then it didn't. The ache turned into something steadier, quieter. Acceptance, maybe. Or the beginning of something close to peace. I walked back inside, the echo of my steps, swallowed by the sound of distant waves. Through the window, the sky shifted from gold to deep blue. Down in the lobby, the Christmas lights blinked, on each one a small defiant spark. I stood there watching them, feeling the hum of the ocean against the glass. There was no anger left, just a strange, calm certainty that whatever was coming next, I'd face it on my own terms. The sea roared softly in the distance. The Solara Bay sign glowed steady against the dark. I closed my eyes for a moment and breathed in the salt air. Perfect. And this time I actually meant it. I was 15 the year my sister got a car for Christmas. A red Mini Cooper with a white bow on top parked in the driveway like a commercial. My father handed Chloe the keys with that proud half-smile of his. The one I used to think was reserved for success. My gift was smaller. A leather-bound notebook wrapped in silver paper. "For your future plans," my mother said, her voice too gentle, as if softness could hide imbalance. I smiled, said thank you, and pressed my thumb against the gold lettering. It left a faint dent. I remember standing by the window watching Chloe reverse out of the driveway while everyone clapped. I waved too, because that's what you do when you're raised in a house that mistakes politeness for peace. My mother came to stand beside me, the smell of cinnamon and coffee still on her sweater. She brushed a strand of hair from my face. "You know your father," she said quietly. "He just wants you to focus on school." I nodded, though I didn't understand why love had to come with explanations. Later that night, after the noise died, and Chloe left to show her car to her friends, I opened the notebook. The first page was blank, except for my own reflection in the lamplight. I didn't know what to write yet, so I wrote the only thing that felt true. Remember this. That was 2005. The year I realized gifts could be instructions. Years passed, and so did birthdays, graduations, dinners, where I sat beside an empty chair because someone couldn't make it. My father's company, Hart & Coney, grew bigger, and so did his absence. I learned to measure affection by the time between his emails. In 2011, when the acceptance letter from UC Berkeley arrived, I showed it to my mother first. She smiled, proud but hesitant. "That's far," she said. "Your father will worry." He didn't. He barely looked up from his phone when I told him. "Berkeley," he muttered. "Why not Santa Barbara closer to home?" "I want to study hospitality management," I said. "They have a good program." He shrugged. "Suit yourself?" Then he left the kitchen, leaving the smell of his cologne and the weight of permission that never felt like approval. The morning I left for college, there was no family photo, no speech about beginnings. My mother hugged me tight on the porch, her sweater damp from the coastal mist. My father wasn't there. He had a meeting in Los Angeles. The bus to San Francisco rattled like it was held together by hope. I pressed my forehead to the window, watching the horizon blur. Somewhere between the hills and the ocean, the world opened up, wild, wide, untamed. For the first time, I saw the Pacific glitter in full daylight. It looked endless, like freedom disguised as water. I whispered to myself, "If I can see the ocean, maybe I'll never feel trapped again." College was nothing like home. My dorm smelled of ramen and ambition. My roommates were loud, messy, alive. I loved it. I worked nights at a small boutique hotel in Monterey, the Mariner's Rest. It was old, with faded carpets and creaky floors. But I didn't mind. It was a living classroom. I started keeping notes in the same leather-bound book from years ago. Check-in systems, how to fold towels perfectly, how to remember guests' names without looking at ID cards. I learned that hospitality wasn't about service. It was about seeing people, really seeing them in a world that often didn't. The manager, an older woman named Mrs. Duffy, noticed my obsession. "You're not just working," she said one night as we counted receipts. "You're studying people." I smiled. "I guess I'm just taking notes." She laughed. "Well, maybe one day you'll run a place like this. Just with better carpets." I wrote that down too. There were nights I walked home past the marina, the smell of salt and diesel in the air, and looked at the row of darkened windows above the ocean. I imagined what it would feel like to own one of those buildings, to fill it with light and warmth, to create a space where nobody felt like they didn't belong. In the quiet of my rented room, I'd open the notebook again. On the newest page, I wrote, "One day I'll have a place of my own, a place where no one gets told they're not needed." The words looked small at first, fragile, like they might break if I stared too hard. But the longer I looked, the stronger they felt. I closed the notebook and listened to the waves rolling in through the cracked window. The sound was steady, like a heartbeat that wasn't mine, but somehow kept me alive. Back then, I didn't know that those notes, those late-night scribbles and quiet promises, would turn into blueprints. I didn't know that every slammed door, every dismissal, every polite silence was quietly building the foundation for something vast. All I knew was that the ocean never told me I didn't belong, and that was enough to keep going. By 2018, I was done asking for permission. The blueprints for the Solara Bay Hotel were spread across the conference table of the Monterey City Council chamber, each line drawn by my own hand. Each measurement a piece of the dream I'd carried since those late nights at the Mariner's Rest. I'd rehearsed the presentation 100 times down to how I'd pause between slides. Still, when I saw my father sitting in the back row, arms crossed, jaw tight, the air in the room seemed to shrink. The meeting began with polite nods and bureaucratic smiles. The council members glanced through their notes while I spoke about sustainable architecture, coastal preservation, and job creation. I talked about solar panels, reclaimed wood, and community programs. When I finished, there was a small round of applause. Half-hearted, the kind that fills silence but changes nothing. Then one of the councilmen cleared his throat. "Ms. Hart," he said, "there are concerns about large-scale private development near the shoreline. Some say it doesn't align with the city's image." Before I could respond, I heard a familiar voice behind me. "What she means is, it doesn't align with her father's image," someone muttered. I didn't need to turn around to know it was one of the contractors tied to Hart & Co. I steadied my voice. "My project stands on its own merit. It's not affiliated with my father's company." They nodded politely, pretending to care. When the meeting adjourned, I gathered my folders, keeping my face calm. My father waited near the exit. He didn't say a word until the last person left the room. "Con dang lam diu ngunguk," he said in Vietnamese, like he did whenever he wanted his anger to sound private. Then he switched back to English. "A hotel on the coast. You have no idea what you're getting into. This isn't a hobby, Madeline. This is a war zone." "I'm not afraid of wars," I said quietly. "I was raised in one." He gave a sharp laugh. "You're not built for this. Women in this business survive because they have someone behind them, a partner, a man who knows how to play the game." I met his eyes. "Then maybe you're looking the wrong direction. I'm not looking for someone behind me. I'm looking for a way forward." He didn't answer. He just exhaled through his nose the way he did when board meetings didn't go his way and walked out. His cologne lingered like a closing argument. 2 weeks later, I received a letter from the city. Permit denied. The official reason, non-compliance with environmental zoning. The unofficial one came from a friend inside the department who whispered, "Your father made a few calls. Said the project could hurt community reputation." For 2 days, I stared at the rejection letter pinned to my wall. Then I drove to San Jose to meet a lawyer I'd found through a business forum, Evelyn Cruz. The cafe smelled of burnt espresso and rain. Evelyn was in her mid-50s with dark hair streaked silver and eyes that looked like they'd seen too much and decided to keep going anyway. She extended her hand. "You're Richard Hart's daughter. Brave of you to show up here." "I'm not here because of my father," I said. She smiled faintly. "Good. Because if you think you were blocked for any reason other than being a woman trying to build something alone, you're wrong. But lucky for you, that's my specialty." We worked together for months, collecting documents, revising plans, building a case. Evelyn didn't talk much about herself, but she told me once that she'd lost her first firm after reporting a partner for harassment. "Justice isn't blind," she said. "It's just slow. So we keep pushing." The hearing was held in the same cold municipal room where I'd first been dismissed. My father didn't come, but his lawyer, Benjamin Cole, sat at the opposite table, sharp suit, sharper smirk. He called my project a sentimental gamble and said it posed reputational risk to the community. I watched him gesture toward my blueprints like they were pieces of a naive fantasy. When it was my turn, I walked to the podium and laid out my evidence. Environmental impact reports, letters from local businesses, data on projected employment. I spoke clearly, evenly, as if each word could rebuild what they'd tried to dismantle. When I finished, the room was quiet. Then the council chair adjusted his glasses. "The permit will be reinstated," he said, "effective immediately." It took me a second to process it. Evelyn grinned and squeezed my hand. "Welcome to the war zone, kid," she whispered. "Looks like you just won your first battle." Outside, the sky was clear after weeks of rain. I stood on the courthouse steps, breathing in the sharp winter air. Evelyn lit a cigarette, holding it like punctuation. "Don't mistake this for justice," she said. "Justice doesn't happen on its own. You earned this." I nodded, watching the smoke curl upward, dissolving into nothing. I wanted to feel triumphant. I wanted to call my father to tell him I'd done it, that I'd built something without him. But I knew how that conversation would go. He'd either ignore it or take credit for teaching me resilience, so I didn't call. Instead, I drove back to Monterey, rolled down the window, and let the wind hit my face. The coastline unfurled beside me, endless and wild, as if reminding me why I started. By the time I reached the empty plot of land where the hotel would stand, the sun was setting. The waves crashed against the rocks like applause. I stepped out of the car and walked to the edge of the cliff. For the first time, I could see it. The Solara Bay Hotel, not as lines on paper, but as something alive. Glass walls catching the sunrise laughter echoing through the halls, the sound of the ocean just beyond the doors. The vision was so clear I almost believed I could walk inside. Behind me, gulls screamed over the surf. The wind was sharp, but I didn't flinch. Maybe my father was right about one thing: this business was a war. But I'd stopped fighting to be part of his world. I was building my own battlefield, my own peace. And for once, I didn't need anyone behind me. By the spring of 2021, the Solara Bay Hotel stood finished. A streak of pale wood and glass overlooking the Pacific sunlight, catching every surface like it was built to hold light. I remember standing on the terrace that first morning, coffee in hand, watching the ocean shimmer beneath a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. Tom Gallagher was barking orders down in the lobby, his voice carrying through the open atrium. No fingerprints on the glass people. This place should look like the ocean built it. Tom had the posture of someone who'd spent half his life on battlefields. He'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan, came back to a country that didn't know what to do with him, and somehow ended up in hospitality. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. He looked up, spotted me watching from the railing, and grinned. "Boss, I've worked with colonels who were less demanding than you." I smiled back, maybe because I spent my whole life living by other people's standards. "Now I finally get to make my own." He laughed, shaking his head. "Fair enough. Just try not to scare the new hires." Grace Nguyen was crouched in the corner of the lobby with a camera filming workers polishing marble and hanging art. She was 27, born and raised in San Jose, whip-smart, always carrying 2 phones, and a battery pack the size of a brick. "Hold that pose, Ms. Hart," she called out. "The sunlight's doing something incredible right now." I turned slightly toward the window. "Grace, it's a construction site, not a photo shoot." "Exactly," she said, snapping a few shots. "People love before and after stories. They'll want to see what this place looked like before the world started coming here." She had a point. The camera clicked, and for a second I saw myself the way she probably did, standing in a lobby that still smelled like fresh paint, half terrified, half unstoppable. We opened the doors officially on May 12th. The first guests walked through at sunset. The lobby lights glowed honey gold against the evening sky, and I stood by the reception desk pretending not to hold my breath. Tom moved like clockwork, checking staff rotations, adjusting a vase of orchids that didn't need adjusting. Grace flitted between guests, filming candid moments for the hotel's social feed. By 8 p.m., the place was alive. Laughter spilled from the bar glasses, clinked music played low and smooth. I looked around and realized this. Every sound, every detail, was exactly how I'd imagined it. Except for one thing. I had sent invitations. 2 of them, actually. One to my mother, one to Chloe. Handwritten, simple. "The Solara Bay opens May 12th. I'd love for you to see it." Neither of them came. I checked my phone once that evening. Nothing. Then I turned it off. Around 9, I stepped out onto the terrace, watching the glow of the lobby spill onto the patio. A journalist was waiting for me there. Alex Monroe. We'd known each other at Berkeley. Back then, he'd been the editor of the campus magazine, and had once told me, "You'll end up in management someday. You're too stubborn not to." He looked exactly the same, slightly unshaven, too curious for his own good. "Congratulations," he said, handing me a business card. "This place is stunning. I didn't think you were serious when you told me in college you'd build a hotel by the ocean." "I didn't think anyone would let me," I said. He raised an eyebrow. "Including your father." I exhaled slowly, leaning against the glass railing. "Especially him." He nodded, scribbling something in his notebook. "Mind if I ask how it feels, starting over? Building something this big, and doing it without your family here tonight?" For a moment, I almost said the polite thing. "It's fine. They'll visit later. We're all busy." But the truth had already learned how to speak on its own. "I'm not starting over." I said, "I'm starting in the right place." He didn't write that down, but I saw his eyes soften. "That's a good line. Maybe I'll borrow it someday. Just spell my name right," I said. We both laughed. He left soon after, and I stayed on the terrace, watching the waves shimmer under the moonlight. The air smelled of salt and champagne. Inside, a soft jazz band played. The dining room glowed in candlelight, guests clinking glasses of Prosecco, the sound of forks against porcelain. It was the smallest opening night imaginable, yet it felt vast. I walked quietly through the room, greeting guests, thanking the staff. Tom saluted me playfully from behind the bar, and Grace followed me with her camera, whispering, "Pretend I'm not here." "You're pointing a lens at my face." "Exactly. Pretend harder." She caught a shot of me leaning on the counter, staring at the reflection of the candles in the glass. Later, when I saw that photo, I realized how calm I looked. Inside, I was trembling. Not from fear. From the strange weight of solitude that doesn't hurt anymore. There's a kind of loneliness that feels like loss. But there's another kind, the kind that feels like air. That night, I breathed it in fully. As the crowd thinned, I walked back to my office and found the gift box Tom had left on my desk. Inside was a single seashell, smooth and white, resting on a folded note. "For when you forget why you built this." I held it in my palm, the cool surface pressing against my skin. The hotel hummed quietly around me, the ocean outside steady as a heartbeat. I thought of my father, my mother, Chloe, their empty seats, their unread messages. Then I thought of the people who had shown up, the staff, the guests, the strangers who believed in something they hadn't seen until tonight. Grace knocked on the door camera still hanging from her neck. "Ms. Hart." Before we wrap for the night, I had an idea. What kind of idea? "A story," she said. "We should document this place. The whole journey. Why you built it, what it means. It could inspire people who've been told they're not enough." I smiled, exhaustion softening into something warm. "You really think anyone wants to hear about rejection and blueprints?" Grace shrugged. "I think people want to see what it looks like when someone refuses to disappear." She had no idea how much those words landed. "Fine," I said. "Let's tell it. But keep it honest." She lifted her camera, already recording. "Honest is all I do." The red light blinked once, steady and small, as the sound of waves filled the room. I didn't pose. I didn't smile. I just stood there, surrounded by the thing I'd built from silence. And for the first time, the silence felt like home. The news broke on a Tuesday morning, the kind of morning when the sky was too calm for what it was about to deliver. I was sitting on the edge of my bed, a cup of coffee cooling in my hands, when the headline flashed across the TV. "Business magnate Richard Hart under investigation for land manipulation and zoning fraud in Santa Barbara." For a second, I thought I'd misheard it. But then they showed his photo, my father's photo, standing in front of the Hart & Condon building, expressionless, the same way he used to look at me across dinner tables when I said something he didn't approve of. The reporter's voice carried on steady and merciless. "Sources confirm that the investigation involves several council members and Hart's legal representative, Benjamin Cole." They cut to an image of Benjamin smirking in an old press conference, the kind of man who looked like he'd never lost a case in his life. The caption underneath read, "License suspended pending review." I turned off the sound but kept watching. The video continued silently. Drone footage of the Hart estate, the same one where we used to spend Christmas mornings pretending to be a family. I didn't feel satisfaction. I didn't even feel anger. Just the weight of irony sitting heavy in the air. My phone buzzed. Evelyn Cruz's name lit up the screen. When I answered, her voice was calm, low, the way it got when she wanted me to really listen. "I figured you'd see it by now," she said. "I did. Don't let it pull you under, kid. Karma doesn't need witnesses. But don't confuse closure with victory either. You don't have to celebrate what the universe already settled." I looked out the window. The Pacific was glassy silver blue, too still for comfort. "I'm not celebrating," I said. "I just wish he'd learned before the lesson cost so much." "That's not your responsibility." She was right. It wasn't. But knowing that didn't make it lighter. Before we hung up, she said softly, "You keep building, Madeline. Let the storms fall where they may." After the call, I sat in silence, watching the headlines scroll across the bottom of the muted TV. Then another name appeared. Chloe Hart. A reporter was chasing her across a parking lot, microphones flashing. "Miss Hart, can you comment on the contracts between your design firm and Hart & Co.? Were you aware of your father's dealings?" Chloe looked pale, caught off guard. "No comment," she said, her voice shaking. Cameras followed her to her car. She shut the door too hard. Eyes wide, almost frightened. I exhaled, set my coffee on the table. "Every silence has a cost," I murmured. Hers was just due. The TV flickered to black. I turned it off completely. There was a knock at the door. Daniel Reed stood there, windblown and smiling faintly. "Sorry to drop by unannounced. I was in the area checking the bluff line and figured I'd see how your foundation's holding up. The tides have been rough this season." He had that easy steadiness that came from years on construction sites, sun-tanned, skin-rolled sleeves, the smell of salt and sawdust. I hadn't seen him in months, not since the last maintenance project we did on the retaining walls behind the hotel. "Come in," I said. "You're just in time for the end of the world." He laughed. "That bad, worse. My father's company's collapsing, and for once it's not my fault." Daniel glanced at the dark TV. "You okay?" "Fine," I lied, just thinking about how long it takes for truth to catch up to some people. He set his tool bag by the door and walked over to the window. "The ocean's a strange teacher," he said. "It changes every day, but it never hides what it is. People. We're not that honest." I joined him, arms folded. "You talk like someone who's in love with the sea," he smiled. "Maybe I just respect something that never pretends." He pointed toward the horizon. "See that color shift? The darker streak near the south point. That's the current turning. It's how you know a storm's coming." I looked out. The sky, once clear, was thickening with slow-moving clouds. "You think it'll hit here?" "Hard to say, but I'd double-check the drainage lines near the east terrace just in case." He turned to leave, but paused. "You've built something strong here. You know that, right? Strong doesn't always mean safe." He tilted his head. "Maybe not, but I've seen the materials. I've seen how you work. A storm can shake the glass, but it won't bring down a foundation built with real belief." I smiled faintly. "Thank you. Though technically belief isn't a load-bearing structure." He laughed, a quiet, low sound that somehow made the room feel less heavy. "Then it's a good thing you built this place with more than belief." After he left, I stood by the window again, watching the waves roll harder against the rocks. The first flashes of lightning blinked somewhere far out at sea, too distant to hear, but close enough to feel. I thought about my father, about every boardroom meeting he'd dominated, every word he'd used like a weapon. The man who once told me that emotion was weakness now sat under investigation for the very thing he'd built his life on control. Maybe Evelyn was right. Karma didn't need applause. I reached for the coffee cup again. It had gone cold. Outside, a seagull fought against the wind wings bent, but it didn't fall. The storm hadn't reached shore yet, but it would. I could feel it gathering slow and inevitable just beyond the horizon. And as I stood there watching the first heavy clouds roll toward the coast, I realized something: some storms don't destroy you. They reveal who's strong enough to stay standing when they arrive. By December 30th, the wind had already changed. The Pacific had that gray, restless color it gets before a storm. Waves, heavier air, colder, the kind of chill that sneaks under your skin even when you're inside. I stood in my office, staring at the reservation board. Half the screen was red. Canceled. 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 Tom leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed, jaw tight. "That's another 10 gone. Between the storm warning and flight cancellations, we're looking at maybe 20% occupancy for New Year's Eve." I nodded slowly, eyes still on the numbers. "We'll survive," he frowned. "We'll survive, sure, but we'll take a hit. Big one." Grace appeared behind him, tablet in hand, scrolling through messages. Social media's full of people changing their plans. Monterey's practically emptying out. I looked past them toward the lobby below. The chandeliers were already lit, the glass railings glowing like they were waiting for someone to admire them. The music from the lounge was playing softly, a jazz instrumental of "What Are You Doing New Year's Eve?" And it felt almost cruel in the emptiness. Downstairs, the front desk clerk adjusted a bowl of mints for the third time that hour. The bartender wiped the same glass twice. The hotel was beautiful, but beauty meant nothing without life in it. Tom followed my gaze. "It's eerie, huh? All that light and no one to see it." Something clicked then. A small thought, absurd at first, but it wouldn't leave. I turned toward him. "What if we open the doors anyway?" He frowned. "They're open." "No," I said. "I mean, open them. To everyone. No reservations, no check-in list. Just people. Anyone who doesn't have a place to go." Tom blinked at me like I'd just suggested we start a commune. "That's risky. Not to mention illegal in about 12 ways. You can't just throw open a hotel, Maddie. We've got liability insurance. I'm not talking about a party. I'm talking about shelter. Food. Warmth. It's going to be a cold night, Tom. People are stranded. Maybe it's time this place stood for more than profit margins." He exhaled hard, and when the pipes burst from overuse or someone slips on the marble, "You're the one they'll sue." Grace, who'd been silent, finally looked up from her tablet. "Actually," she said carefully, "if we do it right, this could be good. Not just morally, publicly. The hotel as a New Year's Haven story. Local news would eat it up. Tom shot her a look. You're not helping. She ignored him. We could post something now. Simple, elegant, picture of the lobby caption. If you have nowhere to celebrate, Solara Bay has room for you. Hashtag free for all. It's human, hopeful. It could go viral in under an hour. I turned the idea over in my mind. It sounded reckless, but it also felt right. Maybe recklessness was just courage wearing a different name. Tom rubbed his temples. You're really doing this? I smiled faintly. You always said I was the most stubborn boss you've had. Yeah, he muttered. Didn't mean it as a compliment. Grace was already typing. I'll need a photo. Warm, lighting. No people, just the space. I led her to the lobby. The grand staircase curved like a wave, strings of golden bulbs draped along the banister. The air smelled of vanilla candles and sea salt. She crouched low, adjusted the exposure, and took the shot. The picture glowed on her screen. Soft, inviting quiet. Perfect, she said. Posting now. Tom hovered behind her. You're sure about this? I'm sure we can handle whatever happens next. The post went live at 5:07 p.m. We watched the numbers rise in real time. Likes, comments, shares. Within 10 minutes, someone wrote, "Is this real?" Then another. We're driving through from Carmel. Do you mean anyone can come? Grace replied. Anyone. She looked up at me. Congratulations. You've just broken the internet. By dinner, local news stations had picked it up. The headline read, Solara Bay Hotel offers free shelter and celebration amid storm warnings. My phone buzzed nonstop with notifications, journalists requesting interviews, people thanking us, people skeptical. Through it all, I stayed quiet. I didn't want to explain it. I didn't need to. At 9, Evelyn called. You made the news, she said, her voice warm. I didn't plan to. Good. That's when the best decisions happen, when you stop planning and start listening. I could hear her smile through the phone. You found the right answer to exclusion, kid. You opened a door instead of slamming one. That's how you win without fighting. After we hung up, I walked the halls of the hotel. Room after room glowed softly in the lamplight. Some were still empty. Others had lights turned on by staff preparing for whoever might arrive. The storm outside was building. You could hear it in the whistle through the vents. The air carried that heavy electric promise of rain. I stood in the center of the lobby, the marble cool beneath my shoes, and looked up at the chandelier. Its crystals trembled slightly from the wind outside, scattering light across the walls like stars. Tom came down the stairs, hands in his pockets. You know, I keep trying to figure out if this is crazy or brilliant. Maybe both, I said. He gave a short laugh. At least you're consistent. I looked around us. The empty chairs, the soft music, the glow waiting for people who hadn't arrived yet. If they don't come, that's okay. We did what we could. They'll come, he said. People always show up when someone leaves the light on. His words hung in the air long after he left. I walked to the front doors. The wind hit the glass hard, then eased again. Out beyond the parking lot, the horizon blurred into rain. The lobby lights reflected in the doors, doubling everything. Me, the chandeliers, the empty couches. I reached out and touched the glass, my hand aligning with my reflection. People don't always need to burn bridges to move on. Sometimes all you have to do is light the path and let others see where they took the wrong turn. I turned off the main overhead lights, leaving only the warm, amber glow from the sconces. The space looked softer that way, like a promise instead of a building. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall. By the afternoon of December 31st, the sky had turned the color of wet concrete, heavy and restless. The wind came off the Pacific in short, biting gusts that made the glass panels of the hotel hum. Inside, the Solara Bay was glowing, lamps lit, candles flickering along the grand staircase, wreaths of white pine and lavender, catching the golden light. Tom Gallagher was pacing the lobby like a man waiting for bad news. Nothing yet. He muttered, glancing toward the doors. Maybe everyone decided to ride out the storm somewhere safer. Before I could answer, a sharp knock echoed through the entryway. We both froze. Then again, 3 quick knocks, softer this time. Tom looked at me. You expecting someone? I shook my head. No one knows me well enough to just show up. He walked over, unlocked the latch, and pulled open the door. A woman stood there, her coat soaked through hair plastered against her cheeks. She was in her late 40s, maybe holding the hand of a boy no older than 10. Behind them, rain sliced across the parking lot in white streaks. "Sorry," she said, voice shaking. "I saw your post online. Something about open doors. Do you still have room?" I stepped forward. "Of course. Come in. No one's left outside tonight." She exhaled relief, softening her face. The boy clutched his backpack, eyes darting around the warm lobby. Tom took their wet coats, hanging them near the heater. "Linda Porter," she said, introducing herself. "And this is Jacob. Welcome to Solara Bay," I said. "We're glad you found us." They weren't the last. Within the hour, the lobby filled like a tide coming in, slow, steady, unstoppable. A gray-haired man arrived next, his duffel bag patched with military logos. "Saw your post?" he said, nodding. "Figured it beats sleeping in my truck again." His name was Frank, a retired Marine. Tom shook his hand silently and led him toward the lounge. Then came 3 college students from Oregon, drenched and laughing, saying the storm had rerouted their road trip. After them, a young couple who'd gotten lost on Highway 1. When the visibility dropped, their car, stranded in a ditch until a tow truck rescued them near town. Each time the door opened, the cold came with it. Wind, rain, the smell of salt. But it was always followed by warmth, by the sight of someone new stepping inside and realizing they didn't have to spend New Year's alone. Grace moved around with her camera, capturing moments quietly, the boy sipping hot cocoa, Frank hanging his coat by the fire, the college kids setting up a makeshift playlist on a small speaker. She turned to me between shots. "You know this looks like a miracle, right?" I smiled faintly. "It looks like what people do when someone finally leaves a light on." An hour later, the door opened again, and a woman stepped in carrying a small dog wrapped in a shawl. She was probably in her 70s, silver hair in a neat bun, and her eyes widened as she looked around. "Madeline Hart," she said softly. "Well, I'll be damned. I thought that name on the post couldn't be the same girl I used to know." It took me a moment, then I recognized her. Mrs. Pierce," she laughed. "Ellie, please. I run the bookstore near Cannery Row. Your mother used to stop by and tell me how impossible you were." "That sounds like her," I said. She held out a small bundle of lavender. "For your lobby. A little peace in the storm." I took it gently. "Thank you." Ellie looked around at the tables being set up, the candles glowing along the bar, the people settling into chairs. "You've turned solitude into light, dear," she said. "That's rarer than gold." As the evening deepened, the smell of lavender and cinnamon drifted through the air. Tom organized a dinner table down the center of the lobby. Grace brought out trays of bread and soup from the kitchen. Frank opened a bottle of wine he'd kept from last Christmas, saying, "Figured tonight's as good a time as any." For a while, I just stood on the mezzanine, watching it all unfold. The laughter, the conversations between strangers, the soft clinking of dishes. It was everything I'd imagined a family gathering should be, except none of these people shared blood. Maybe that was the point. Then my phone buzzed. I didn't need to look to know the name, but I did. Richard Hart. The name glowed on the screen, harsh against the soft light of the room. I hesitated, thumb hovering over the call icon. The reflection of the chandelier shimmered across the phone's glass, the champagne in my hand trembling slightly. I let it ring. When it stopped, I flipped the phone over on the table face down. Not every call deserves an answer. I raised my glass instead, watching the flicker of the candles bounce off its surface. Around me, voices rose in laughter. Grace was teaching Jacob how to film a slow-motion clip on her camera. Ellie arranged lavender sprigs in small vases. The storm outside thrashed against the glass, but inside it was all warmth and light. Sometimes silence isn't emptiness. Sometimes it's freedom. The wind howled through the outer vents, rattling the windows. Tom walked past, checking the locks. "Storm's coming in stronger than forecast," he said. "Then we'll keep the lights brighter," I answered. He paused, nodded once, and smiled. As I turned back toward the room, the main doors swung open slightly, wind rushing in and making the candle flames dance wildly. A few people gasped, then laughed as Tom hurried to close it. For a second, the gust filled the air with salt and rain, and the electric scent of the ocean. It swept through the room like a whisper of something bigger on its way. The candles steadied again, glowing softer now, like they were waiting for the next chapter to begin. By 9 o'clock, the storm had turned the coastline into thunder. The wind screamed against the glass walls of Solara Bay, and the sound of waves slamming into the rocks below rose like the heartbeat of something wild and ancient. Rain streaked sideways across the windows, blurring the world into streaks of silver and shadow. Inside the hotel glowed like a lantern. The The lobby was warm, alive, the air filled with the scent of lavender and soup simmering in the kitchen. Tom was checking the generator panel near the service hall, muttering numbers under his breath. Grace was upstairs helping the Oregon students carry blankets and spare pillows to the empty guest rooms, her laughter echoing faintly down the staircase. The news on the radio said Highway 1 was closed. Fallen trees, flooded shoulders, zero visibility. We were officially cut off from the world. For a heartbeat, the thought unsettled me. Then it didn't. There was something oddly comforting about being stranded together. When I came back to the lobby, everyone was gathered near the lounge. A few candles flickered on the piano, their flames bending in rhythm with the storm outside. I stepped onto the marble floor, raised my voice just enough to be heard above the rain. "Looks like we're all stuck here tonight," I said. "So, why don't we make it a real New Year's Eve?" A ripple of laughter moved through the group. Someone clapped. Frank, the retired Marine, called out, "As long as there's something to drink." "I'm in," Grace appeared, her hair, damp cheeks flushed. "I can play something," she said, sitting down at the piano. Her fingers hovered above the keys for a second, then she began the soft, familiar notes of Auld Lang Syne. The melody floated through the air, gentle at first, then fuller, as others hummed along. Linda Porter and her son Jacob sat by the fire. The boy had a mug of cocoa nearly bigger than his hands. Linda looked tired in the way that comes from years, not days. "We weren't supposed to be here," she said quietly when I sat beside her. "My ex-husband took our usual plans when he took everything else. Jacob wanted to see the ocean, so we just started driving." She smiled, faintly, eyes glistening. "Guess we found the right place to stop." Across the room, Frank was telling the students about his time stationed overseas, his voice steady but threaded with memories. "My wife used to send me letters every week," he said, holding up an old chain around his neck. "Still got every one." The students listened respectful, one of them handing him a slice of pizza they'd brought in from their car. "We were going to eat this while camping on the beach," one said. "But this feels way better." Laughter filled the space again, soft and genuine. Someone adjusted the candles, and their glow spilled across faces, tired, grateful, alive. I leaned against the doorway, watching. Maybe this was what belonging looked like when you stripped it of bloodlines and expectations. Just people sharing warmth because the alternative was cold. For the first time in a long time, my chest felt light. I thought of my family, of their gated houses and glass tables, the way their dinners always ended with polite silence. And I realized that here among strangers trapped by weather, I felt more seen than I ever had in those rooms. Outside, thunder cracked. The lights flickered, buzzed, then blinked out completely. A few startled gasps echoed. Jacob clutched his mother's arm. Tom's voice came calm and steady through the dark. Backup power kicking in. "Hang tight." A moment later, the low hum of the generator filled the silence, and the lights flickered back on, softer now, amber and warm, casting long shadows across the lobby. It felt like the whole building exhaled with us. Tom came back wiping his hands. "We're good," he said. "Running on reserve, but good." Ellie Pierce smiled from her seat near the piano. "You know storms like this," she said, "they have a purpose. They make us stop running, make us sit still long enough to remember each other." I looked around the room again. Grace was playing something new now, a slow, improvised tune that sounded halfway between hope and memory. Frank was pouring wine into mismatched glasses. The students were teaching Jacob a card game on the rug. Linda leaned back, eyes closed, finally resting. And for a moment, it was perfect. We weren't family, not by blood or obligation, but we shared the same roof, the same storm, the same need to be somewhere safe when the world outside raged too hard. I whispered to myself, maybe this is the kind of family I needed all along. No expectations, just presence. The rain grew louder, pounding the glass like applause. Lightning flashed, painting the room in silver for a split second. Grace's fingers paused over the keys, then resumed slower this time, softer. I glanced at Tom, who was leaning against the wall, eyes half closed, listening. "You look almost relaxed," I said. "Don't ruin it," he replied. Then quieter. "You did a good thing, Maddie." I shook my head. "I just opened the door." Same thing. Outside, the storm kept roaring. Inside, the air pulsed with laughter, warmth, and the soft hum of the generator. I caught Ellie's eyes from across the room. She nodded at me, her voice barely louder than the rain. "You see, dear, not all storms destroy. Some just make room for people to find each other." I smiled, the words settling deep. The windows rattled again, but no one flinched this time. Grace played the final notes of her song, the sound lingering in the air like a sigh. Someone began to hum along. Someone else clapped offbeat laughing. The storm had locked us in together, but somehow it had also set us free. As the camera Grace had left running on a side table caught the reflection of the room. The rain on the glass made the lights shimmer like tiny stars. Outside, the ocean howled. Inside, we answered with laughter. At 10:15, the sound of tires screeching outside sliced through the hum of music and laughter. Headlights swept across the glass facade, flooding the lobby in a flash of white before fading back into the storm. Everyone turned. The only thing louder than the wind for a moment was silence. Tom was the first to move. He stepped toward the entrance, muttering under his breath. Nobody drives in weather like this. He pulled open the door, just as a figure emerged from the downpour. A man in a soaked overcoat, his hair plastered to his forehead, face drawn tight. I didn't need to see his eyes to know who it was. Richard Hart, my father. He paused at the threshold, rainwater dripping from his cuffs, his presence pulling the warmth out of the room like a sudden draft. The guests nearest the door fell quiet, unsure if they should move or stare. Tom squared his shoulders. Sorry, sir. The hotel's closed to new arrivals tonight. No exceptions. Richard's voice was low, sharp, the kind that used to make boardrooms go silent. Do you know who I am? Tom didn't flinch. Doesn't matter. Rules are rules. I came down the stairs before this could turn into a scene. It's fine, Tom. I said softly. Let him in. Richard's eyes found mine immediately, that same calculating glance I'd grown up under. For a second, the storm seemed quieter. Then he stepped forward, water pooling at his feet on the marble floor. The light from the chandeliers struck his face, outlining the age in it, the creases around his mouth, the pale exhaustion that comes when control begins to slip. He looked around the lobby, his gaze catching on the strangers gathered around the long table, the candles, the laughter. What is this? He asked, voice cutting through the air. What kind of spectacle are you putting on? I folded my arms. A celebration. For everyone who didn't have a place to go. He stared at me like I was speaking another language. You invited strangers into your hotel during a storm. Yes, I said, because no one should be left outside just because they weren't on the list. His jaw tightened. You're turning this place into a circus. Maybe, but at least no one's standing in the cold watching it from the street. He opened his mouth, then stopped glancing around again. Frank the Marine nodded politely from his chair. Linda was whispering something to her son. Ellie Pierce watched quietly from near the piano, her expression unreadable. And then someone said it. A young man near the back, one of the students. Hey, aren't you that guy from the news? The developer who's under investigation? The words dropped like a match into dry grass. Heads turned. Murmurs rippled through the room. Richard stiffened. His shoulders rose and fell once a restrained breath. Without a word, he turned and started toward the staircase. The murmur faded as his footsteps echoed upward, disappearing down the second-floor corridor. Tom exhaled through his nose. Want me to escort him out? He asked quietly. I shook my head. No. He came here for a reason. Let him see what this looks like. Every minute of it. Tom nodded slowly, then went back to the generator room. Grace, camera in hand, glanced toward the staircase. You okay? I don't know yet, I said. But I guess we'll find out. The music picked up again, softer this time. Grace moved through the crowd, filming small fragments. Jacob laughing at Frank's story. Linda lighting another candle, the students helping Ellie carry extra chairs. The rhythm of the evening recovered, but I could feel his presence upstairs heavy and watchful. An hour ago, this place had felt untouchable, sealed off from the world's noise. Now my father's shadow had crossed the threshold, and every breath felt sharper. I tried to shake it off. I poured wine, refilled cups, handed out blankets to guests sitting near the windows. Keep close to the heaters, I told them. The wind's picking up again. A few minutes later, I looked up toward the balcony that overlooked the lobby. There he was, standing in the half-dark, one hand gripping the railing, his shirt collar damp and unbuttoned. He wasn't looking at me directly, but at the scene below people he'd never meet, laughing together without pretense. For a moment, I saw confusion flicker across his face, then something else. Something raw, almost human. He wasn't used to rooms that didn't quiet down when he entered. He wasn't used to joy that didn't revolve around him. Grace must have noticed too, because I saw the soft red light of her camera blink from where she stood by the piano. She lifted the lens just slightly, capturing that moment. The powerful man watching something he couldn't control. The light from the generator lamps painted him in gold and shadow, his reflection trembling in the glass behind him. For a heartbeat, I thought he might come down. Say something. Apologize, maybe. But he didn't. He just stood there, his fingers tightening around the railing, his breath fogging the air in front of him. Downstairs, the guests raised their glasses. The sound of laughter filled the lobby again, weaving through the crackle of the storm. I turned back toward them, smiling, pretending not to feel the weight of his gaze above me. I'd built this place for people who had nowhere to belong. And now, the one who'd taught me what exile felt like was seeing exactly what I'd made out of it. Grace panned her camera slowly upward, following his outline against the light. The frame caught everything. The wet coat, the trembling hand, the quiet, unmistakable look of regret. The storm outside raged harder, wind roaring across the glass, but inside nothing broke. Not tonight. By 11:55, the storm had finally broken. The rain had thinned to a soft mist, and the ocean outside shimmered beneath the returning light. Flood lamps along the pier flickered back to life, their reflections stretching like molten gold across the glass walls of Solara Bay. The entire lobby seemed to hum in anticipation. Voices rising and falling as people gathered by the entrance drawn toward the sound of the sea. Someone dimmed the lights. The chandeliers softened to a warm amber glow. Grace moved quickly through the crowd, setting her camera on the counter, adjusting the angle until it framed everything. The staircase, the people, the wall of glass, revealing the ocean beyond. I stood near the doors, champagne glass in hand, feeling the pulse of the room sync with the waves outside. Tom was handing out party horns to the kids. Linda was laughing for the first time all night, and Ellie was sitting near the piano with Frank, both humming the melody of Auld Lang Syne under their breath. The countdown started somewhere behind me. 10. The voices grew louder. 9. The sound rolled through the room like a tide. 8. 7. Grace whispered, "Look at them, Maddie. You did this." I smiled faintly, eyes on the horizon. "No," I said. "They did." 6. 5. The music faded as people turned toward the windows. Beyond the glass, the ocean was a sheet of silver under the lights, the wind calm for the first time in hours. I lifted my glass slightly, watching the faint reflection of my face blur against the dark water. Then, just as the next number echoed, 4, my phone began to ring. At first, I ignored it, but it buzzed again, and again. When I glanced down, I saw the name. Mom, then Chloe, then Dad. The screen filled with them, missed calls stacking one after another, each new vibration shaking the table slightly. I set it face down beside the candles, the soft glow flickering against the edges of the screen. 3. The crowd's energy surged. Grace turned the camera to face the glass doors, capturing every reflection. Faces pressed close, champagne, glinting, anticipation alive. 2. The wind outside shifted, carrying the first faint echo from the coast. 1. And then the world erupted. Fireworks burst above the Pacific, scattering color across the sky. Gold, violet, blue, bleeding together like watercolor. Their light hit the glass of the hotel and filled the lobby in radiant flashes. The children screamed with joy, Jacob jumping up and down, clutching his mother's hand. People cheered, clinking glasses. Happy New Year. The sound blended with the crash of waves and the distant chorus of celebrations down the coast. I turned, laughing, caught up in it. The warmth, the sound, the sight of strangers hugging like family. For the first time, it didn't feel like I was watching a life I wasn't part of. I was inside it. Across the room, I caught movement near the staircase. Richard stood there, one hand on the railing, his tie loosened his face, unreadable. The fireworks painted his features in flickering light. Blue, then gold, then red. He didn't speak. He just watched. I wondered what he saw. A daughter defying him again, or a woman he didn't quite recognize anymore. Grace's camera caught him in the corner of the frame, just for a heartbeat, his reflection merging with mine in the glass between us. The crowd kept celebrating, shouting over the music, laughing louder as the champagne flowed. The clock on the wall hit midnight and began again. I took a slow sip, feeling the cold of the glass against my lips. The fireworks exploded outside so close, I could almost taste the smoke through the air vents. Jacob ran up, tugging at my sleeve. "Ms. Maddie, look." It's raining colors. I knelt smiling. That's what New Year's are for Jacob, new colors. He grinned, then ran back to his mother. I stayed, kneeling for a moment, watching the reflections dance across the marble floor. The light from the fireworks, the shadows of people embracing the flicker of candlelight that somehow held steady despite the drafts. Then I stood and turned toward the ocean. My phone was still vibrating against the table, a soft, insistent hum beneath the noise. One look at the screen showed the count 128 missed calls. For a moment, I imagined what they were saying, what their faces looked like when they realized the world had seen my open doors, my full tables, my lights glowing across the coast. I wondered if it felt like loss or revelation to them. I left the phone where it was. I raised my glass toward the glass wall and the dark sea beyond. The fireworks burst again, reflected in my eyes, as streaks of purple and gold. I used to dream, I whispered to no one, of being in a room where people were waiting for me to arrive. I looked back at the laughter, the smiles, the lives colliding in this place I'd built. Turns out, I murmured, I just had to open the door and let them in. The final volley of fireworks filled the sky, each explosion echoing through the waves below. Grace caught the moment perfectly. Me standing in the glow, the phone still lit behind me, its screen full of unanswered names. I smiled to myself, glass raised high toward the Pacific. Happy new me. The last spark of light drifted down over the water, fading into the dark. Inside, the laughter carried on warm and endless, drowning out the sound of every call that no longer needed to be answered. The morning light arrived softly, pouring through the glass walls in long, golden stripes that turned the marble floors warm beneath my bare feet. The storm had passed, leaving behind air so clean it almost smelled new. The ocean outside was calm again, its surface smooth as silk, dotted with pieces of sunlight that danced across the horizon. Down in the lobby, someone had left a stack of newspapers by the front desk. The headlines stretched across every one of them in bold type: hotel owner opens doors to strangers. The Solara miracle. I picked one up, scanning the first lines. Alex Monroe's byline sat just under the photo, a wide shot of the hotel lobby glowing with candles. People laughing, a child sitting cross-legged on the floor with cocoa in his hands. My face was there too, mid-laugh, not posed or polished. Just real. Grace was already awake, sitting at the bar counter with her laptop. "We're everywhere," she said, spinning the screen toward me. Dozens of notifications flooded the page. Shares, comments, news outlets tagging Solara Bay, words like hope and humanity repeating in the captions. "We hit 500,000 views overnight," she said, smiling. The internet needed something good to believe in. I smiled, setting the newspaper down. "Looks like we gave them something to talk about." Tom walked by, carrying a toolbox, pretending not to eavesdrop. "Next time you decide to save the world," he said, "give me a heads up. I'll order more coffee." Grace laughed. "You love it." He grunted, but the corner of his mouth turned up before he disappeared toward the maintenance wing. Upstairs, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate. I knew that sound. My father. I looked up as Richard descended the staircase, now dry, composed, but smaller somehow. He paused halfway down, noticing the papers spread across the table, his name appearing in the background of one of the articles. He didn't say a word. His eyes moved from the headline to me, then back again. The silence between us was the same as it had always been. But it felt different now, less like a wall, more like space that could be crossed if either of us tried hard enough. He reached the bottom step, adjusted his cufflinks, and murmured, "Congratulations." Then almost as quickly, he turned and walked toward the door. I let him go. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed. A message from my mother. "You did something your father never could. You opened your heart. I'm proud of you." The words hit like a soft wave. I didn't reply, not because I didn't want to, but because there was nothing left to explain. By the afternoon, the lobby had quieted. Most of the guests had left, leaving behind a few empty glasses, some wilted flowers, and the lingering warmth of laughter. The staff moved quietly, cleaning up the remains of the night. The world outside the glass walls looked brand new, wet, glimmering, full of light. That was when Chloe arrived. She stood in the doorway for a long moment before stepping inside. Her hair was tied back, her face pale from travel, eyes tired in the way guilt always makes people look older. "Hey," she said softly. "Hey," I answered. She hesitated, glancing around at the quiet space. "I saw the articles. Everyone's talking about it. About you." I gestured toward the lounge. "You want some tea?" She nodded. We sat near the window where the sun stretched across the table in thin, golden lines. I poured her a cup, the steam curling between us like an unspoken truth. "I was wrong," she said after a while. "About you. About all of it. I kept thinking you were just trying to prove something. I didn't see that you were just trying to build something different. I looked at her, really looked, and saw not the rival my family had turned her into, but the same little sister who once braided my hair before school." "It's okay," I said quietly. "I used to try to prove something too. I just did it with silence." She smiled weakly. "I want to start over." I reached across the table, placing my hand over hers. "Then start." The doors open. We sat there for a long time watching the sea shift from blue to gold as the afternoon stretched on. The waves rolled steady and endless, as if they'd never known chaos. Daniel showed up later with his clipboard and windbreaker brushing sand off his boots. "Just doing a post-storm inspection," he said. "The building held up perfectly." "That's good news," I said. He grinned. "You sound surprised." "I'm just used to things falling apart after they've been tested." He shook his head. "Not this time. You built something that bends with the wind. That's why it's still standing." For a second, our eyes met, and something unspoken passed between us. Something steady like quiet gratitude. He packed his notes and gave a small nod toward the ocean. "You know," he said, "it's strange. The wind shifted direction this morning. Storm season's over." "Yeah," I said softly. "It feels like it." As he left, I walked to the glass doors and pushed them open. The air outside was cool, clean, alive. The sound of the waves was softer now, more like a lullaby than a warning. I could hear Chloe and Grace talking behind me, their voices blending with the gulls overhead. I looked out over the water, the sun settling low, painting everything in honey and rose. Not every victory needs applause. Sometimes it's enough just to watch the people who once forgot you remember you again. When I turned back, I saw my father, through the far window, standing on the terrace above the beach road. He wasn't watching the ocean. He was watching us. Me and Chloe sitting side by side in the light. His hand rested on the railing, the wind tugging at his coat. For the first time, he didn't look powerful or untouchable. He just looked human. He lingered there a moment longer, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the brightness. The waves kept rolling in, steady and patient like forgiveness itself. 2 weeks later, Solara Bay was alive again. The lobby glowed with late morning light, the kind that made the sea look almost glassy from the upper floors. Guests lingered over breakfast, children ran past the fountain in the courtyard, and the scent of coffee drifted up from the cafe. The storm had long passed, but its memory lingered in the way people smiled at one another here, as if the world felt a little safer than it had before. I walked through the hallways, nodding to staff who greeted me by name. Every room was booked. Every laugh echoing off the marble reminded me why I'd built this place. When I reached my office, something caught my eye, a cream-colored envelope resting neatly on my desk. My name written in a hand I knew too well. Richard Hart. I hesitated before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, his handwriting careful, deliberate. "I'm sorry for not believing in you." Beneath that, another document, signed, sealed, notarized. The deed to a parcel of land on the northern ridge, the same one he'd refused to sell me years ago. I sat down reading it twice. There were no explanations, no promises to start over. Just a signature that said more than his words ever could. I placed the deed back into the envelope and slid it into the desk drawer. Some things didn't need to be displayed. They just needed to rest somewhere quiet, where they could stop hurting. Downstairs, the murmur of voices carried through the open doors. Ellie Pierce was in her usual seat near the window, a book in her lap, and her glasses sliding halfway down her nose. She looked up when she saw me. "Morning, dear," she said, closing her book. "You look lighter today." "Maybe I am," I said, walking over. She smiled knowingly. "You got something in the mail, didn't you?" I raised an eyebrow. "You're terrifyingly perceptive." "It's not that hard," she said, setting her book aside. "You've got that look people get when the past finally starts letting go." I leaned against the arm of the chair beside her. "He sent the deed, and a note." Ellie nodded, not surprised. "Of course he did. Men like your father always write their apologies instead of saying them." I laughed softly. "Probably true." She reached over, touching my hand. "You see, forgiveness isn't about waiting for them to deserve it. It's about deciding they can't hold you anymore. Sometimes the hardest forgiveness is the one you never have to say out loud." Her words settled deep the way truths do when they've been earned. I squeezed her hand gently, then stood. "I think I'm going to take a walk," I said. Outside, the air was warm, carrying that faint salt-sweet scent that only comes after rain. The sky stretched endlessly blue, a few wisps of clouds drifting toward the horizon. Children splashed in the pool near the terrace, their laughter cutting through the sound of gulls overhead. Tom was by the bar talking to Daniel, both of them watching as Grace adjusted a tripod for another round of photos. It was all so normal, so simple. The kind of peace I'd once thought I'd have to buy or earn or fight for. But here it was just waiting to be noticed. I walked toward the main entrance. The glass doors reflected the sunlight in sheets of gold. For a moment I saw myself in them, the same reflection that had once looked so hollow. But now the woman staring back wasn't waiting for approval. She wasn't chasing permission. She was standing in her own light. I opened the doors. The ocean wind met me soft and familiar, carrying the scent of seaweed and cedar. It tangled my hair and filled my lungs until I had to close my eyes. When I opened them again, the Pacific shimmered endless and forgiving. I stood there a long while, letting the sunlight pour over me. They had called 128 times, but some calls don't need answers. Some doors are meant to stay closed, not out of anger, but because you finally understand that silence can be its own kind of peace. I thought of my father, my sister, the years spent trying to be seen, and the long, winding road that led me here. For the first time, I didn't feel like I had something to prove. I just felt whole. Behind me, Ellie's voice drifted from the lobby. "You see, my dear, sometimes the hardest thing to do is forgive, especially when the other person never finds the words to ask for it." I smiled, not turning around. Forgiveness wasn't a gift for them. It was the key to my own door. The light shifted gold on glass bright enough to blur the line between sea and sky. If you'd been standing there, you might have thought I was just another hotel owner, watching the morning tide. But to me, it felt like something larger, a closing of one story, and the quiet, hopeful beginning of another. The camera Grace had left on the terrace panned slowly, catching the way the sunlight hit the windows, how it wrapped the whole building in a soft glow. The laughter of children carried faintly through the wind, blending with the rhythm of the surf. And as the frame caught my reflection against the ocean, I knew that everything I'd lost had simply been making room for what was meant to stay. They had called 128 times, but I'd already answered the only call that mattered, the one that came from within. When you finally find your own light, no one can take it from you. The world outside glittered brighter, like it was nodding in agreement. If you've ever been turned away from someone else's table, remember this: you can always build your own. Open your door, let the world in, and when the light finds you, don't look back.